So yeah, got a little bit of a late start, but that's okay. So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Andrew. I am an instructor for AngularBootcamp.com, and I also work for Oasis Digital, which is based in St. Louis. We do front-end development as well as full stack with Node. I also wanted to point out that I have brought some pens and stickers if you're interested on your way out grabbing one. So today I'm going to talk about a particular library that you can use with Angular. It's part of the Angular Material library by Google. I'm going to show a particular component from this library. So just to give an overview of where I'm going to go with the talk, I'm going to introduce Angular and also material design. And then I'll go into the CDK, which is that part of the Angular Material library. And then I'll talk about the drag and drop feature specifically. And then we'll look at some code and example apps. So first of all, what is Angular? So Angular is Google's JavaScript, or actually TypeScript, framework for single-page applications. And so a single-page application is different than traditional web app and web development in that usually when you load a new page, you go and fetch it from the server, and it brings you back a new HTML page and JavaScript and CSS. The difference with single-page apps is that the browser only loads a single HTML page along with a bunch of JavaScript. And then when you navigate to different routes, like different pages essentially, the JavaScript in the client's browser actually swaps out things on the screen. So you don't actually go to the server and load a whole new page. It actually happens all in the client. So there's several different competing frameworks in this space. There's React, which is very well known. There's also Vue now, which is gaining popularity, but so far it's been mostly React and Angular. So Angular, since it's primarily for developing web apps, its main use is for the web, so for both desktop and mobile browsers. You can also target native applications, so you can build mobile apps. I'm most familiar with Ionic, but there's also Cordova NativeScript. You can also build desktop apps with Electron, just as you would with any other sort of JavaScript application. Electron's not specific to Angular. Also, you'll probably see, if you look into different Angular topics, you'll see NG a lot, and that's just an abbreviation for Angular. The other thing I wanted to overview is material design. So this is a design language by Google. It was released by them in 2014, and this is their primary design language for the Android operating system, and now pretty much all of their web applications and applications in general, including their devices. So you can look at the details about the design language itself at material.io. So that's sort of the UI philosophies independent of their implementations. But the broad idea is that it's inspired by paper. So it's not skeuomorphic in the sense that it doesn't look like everyday objects, but it's supposed to mimic the behavior of real objects in that things shouldn't just suddenly appear and suddenly move. They should animate as like things would in the real world. And they should also have things like drop shadows, which you can see on the buttons in the dialog, to sort of look more like sort of like a piece of paper hovering above the background. So since it's a design language that Google uses for everything, they have broad platform support. So iOS, Android, web, and now Flutter. So Angular Material is Google's implementation of Material for the Angular framework. This gives you a whole library of components that you can use, things like buttons and sliders, switches, dialogues. And so because it's built for Angular, it's more than just a CSS and JavaScript component library. So typically, if you're going to use something like Bootstrap or Clarity, things like that, which are more generally CSS component libraries, you need to add like classes to your elements, and then the library would style them according to the library. But because things like Angular Material are targeting Angular, written in Angular, you can bring in Angular directives and just apply them to your components or your elements. And you can also bring in Angular components themselves from the library. So each feature of Angular Material you can bring in with an individual ng module, so that way you don't have to bring in the whole library in order to use it. So it just reduces your bundle sizes a bit. And so the main benefit of Material, like Angular Material, is that you get all of the styling in the box, so you don't have to worry about really anything except theming. You can change the colors of the different elements pretty easily with CSS variables. And they provide a convenient way to do that. But it is very opinionated, so in the sense that your application is going to look like a Google application, which may be fine for what you're doing, but I mean, if you have pretty custom needs, or you need your application to look like the rest of your brand much more closely, maybe it's not the best thing. Now there's some things that you can do with theming that I won't get into that do help you use Angular Material to look less like a Google application. So you can read about that at angular.material.io. And so a part of the Angular Material project is what's called the CDK. This is the Component Development Kit. And so the idea is that this is Angular Material without styling. So the idea is that they provide these sort of lower level building blocks that they use to implement Angular Material, and then you can use those to build your own component library if you wanted to. It's not sort of extremely straightforward in the sense that it's not like you pull a button component out of the CDK and then do your own styling with it. The CDK has lower level things like detecting which direction the text is on the screen for internationalization, like is it left to right or right to left, detecting what kind of browser you're running in, so like Chrome or Firefox, although it actually gives you the lower level like engine name, so things like that. So in theory, you could combine the CDK with other component libraries or your own. But in general, it takes a lot of custom building to use the CDK in that way. But one feature that is really straightforward to use right from the CDK is the drag and drop feature. So they added this to version 7 of the CDK, which was released roughly to coincide with Angular 7. And so this is a library that's part of the CDK that allows you to implement drag and drop declaratively. So instead of writing code that listens for different events that happen and then responding to them and updating your own data structures, you can pretty much just say this thing should be draggable and this area is where you can drag it to. So this is the complete list of features that the CDK drag and drop feature provides. So you can free drag, that is where you have an item on the screen, you can drag it anywhere that you want to, and then when you release the mouse button or your finger on the mobile device, the element stays in that place. You can reorder within a list, so that's kind of like a Trello board, and that's what we see over here. You can reorder items just by dragging them. You can transfer items between lists, so if you have multiple lists and you can move them between lists. You can easily animate certain behaviors of the drag and drop. So two things that they make pretty easy to animate are when you release the mouse button or your finger, You can animate the item moving into the list. You can also animate the reordering of the items, so they'll smoothly move around in the list. It has support for touch devices, custom drag handles, so if you wanted like a specific part of the item to be where you have to touch or click to move it, it supports that. Previews, so this is where you're dragging the item out of a list. It will actually copy the item that you're dragging, and the new item that's under the cursor is the preview. Placeholders, these are the items that stay in the original list or appear in the new list when you hover over it, and we'll see that later. You can also do vertical and horizontal lists. So here we have a vertical list. You can also use the CDK to do horizontal. You can also lock the movement of an item to one axis. And we'll see most of these features, if not all of them, in the example later. So why use the CDK drag and drop rather than another library? Because there are several alternatives. The main reason is that it gives you first-party support. So that means that there are potentially fewer bugs, and bugs that do appear get fixed really rapidly. So in this case, I started using the drag and drop feature in the when they had it as part of the experimental part of Angular Material. So they always have a part of the repo that's for new features that they're going to put in the next version. So I used that last summer to implement drag and drop for a client product, and found a bug where if you had only one item in a list and you dragged it to another list and then you dragged it back, the state was broken for the drag and drop. So I opened an issue on GitHub. They escalated it to like the second highest level of severity within like an hour, and then within 2 days they fixed it and put it into the newest version of the repository. So I thought that was pretty amazing for an experimental feature to have that kind of support. It's also built for Angular, so some other drag and drop things like Dragula are actually wrappers of more general drag and drop libraries that they've wrapped for Angular, which can have some rough edges. I haven't personally used any of these. I know someone who was using Dragula for a project, but I don't know how that went. Having a library that's built for Angular can make things work more smoothly in an Angular app. Yes.
So the other ones are maintained by just hobbyists, and CDK is maintained by Google.
I know that Dragula is by Valor Software, so I think there's a company of some sort behind this. I think these other ones are community libraries, but I'm not 100%. I've not used any of these, but
okay, but they're not maintained by Google,
right?
While CDK is maintained by Google.
That's right.
A quick question on the CDK before we move. Is it so? You're saying with the CDK, if our application is mostly built using Bootstrap, is that something like if I just wanted to use the drag and drop feature, this would be a viable option?
Yeah, definitely. So you can bring in just the drag and drop part of the material, and it'll it'll work with any other library. So it doesn't actually bring in any styling at all. It's just a directive. So the basic way to use the drag and drop feature is to simply add the CDK drag directive to an element in your template, and that will make that item able to be dragged freely anywhere on the screen. If you're not familiar with directives in Angular, they're similar to components, but they don't have a template. So it's going to attach an Angular TypeScript class to this element and add essentially code that can use things with that element. So in this case, it's going to add this drag ability to the element without changing anything else about the element. So the basic way to do that is to just install the CDK. So this is separate from Angular Material, although it's part of the source like in the source code, it's part of the same repository. It's a different npm package. Then you will import the drag and drop module in whatever ng module that you need the drag and drop in. So if your Angular application is split into multiple modules, you can just bring it into the module where you need it. And again, because Angular Material and the CDK split all the features into individual modules, you can pull in just the drag and drop part of that, and then you can add the directive to any element that you want. So I'll go ahead and just briefly show how to do that with Stacklets. So Stacklets is a very convenient way to prototype things with different frameworks. So they initially had support just for Angular, but now they have React as well, Ionic, and even just blank TypeScript projects if you just want to try some TypeScript code. So I'll go ahead and make an Angular project. And so this lets you do it all in your browser. So it's scaffolded out a basic application for me. I have a hello Angular heading in my template. So if I want to add the CDK drag drop module, I can go into dependencies, and this is like doing an npm install. And I'll just type the name of the package, so at Angular/CDK, and it will install it. And then I can go in my app module and import the CDK, the drag drop module. And that will be from right. And then the last thing to do is to add that directive, CDK drag. And then once I do that, if it reloaded, yep, I can drag it around and just release the mouse button and it stays there. So you can do this with pretty much any element. Now I wanted to show what happens if I put it on an Angular component. So if I put it on the hello component here. Now if I try to drag, I can't. And so initially you might think maybe there's something wrong, I need to do something special for this kind of component. But if we look at the inspector for the DOM elements, we can find that the component itself doesn't actually use up any space on the DOM. So when I'm clicking on the H1 inside the component. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can change the display property for your component. So if I made it display block, for example, then it would behave like a div, which means it would take up space, and I would be able to click and drag it now. So that's just something to keep in mind. So then, to show the API for the CDK drag drop feature, I made what people call a playground app, and this lets you poke around with the API and try out different settings. So this looks pretty terrible in terms of styling, because I'm really just trying to show basic behavior. But the idea here is that I'm showing the directives and Angular inputs and outputs that I'm putting on each element. So in this case, I just have a CDK drag directive, so I can drag this anywhere. If I put the lock axis properties, I can lock them to just a single axis. And then for the drag handles, here I can't drag the CDK drag element. I have to use the drag handle elements inside of it to drag the item. So the boxes are like HTML elements. So this is an element inside of the outer element. So this is just CDK drag elements. Now if you want to do drop lists, the easiest way to do that is to use drop list groups. So they added this in the full version of the CDK drag drop. So the experimental version, you had to do this setup between the lists manually. But now, if you have an outer element, so an element, a parent element of the two lists, you can apply the CDK drop list group directive to it, and that will connect the two lists. So now these two lists are connected, and I can drag items between them. So these are elements that have the CDK drop list directive applied, and to have the drag and drop feature work, I need to pass it the data for each item in the list. So in this case, I have an array of strings. This can be any data structure that you want, as long as it's an array of where each element corresponds to an item in the list. And so then I also need to listen to the dropped event, because you have to manually change your backing data when an item is dropped into the same list or a different list in order to update the data structures. But that's the only kind of like imperative code that you have to write. And in Angular, to get the actual event, you have from an event, you need to use the $event variable, which is just part of the Angular library. So that's where this is coming from. And so then for each of these draggable elements, I add the CDK drag directive, and I can use an ng4 to iterate over this list. So it's going to make an element for each item in array A, and then get the string of each element and use that for the content of that element. So the result is that I can drag between the lists, and if you notice, the arrays don't update until I let go of the mouse button, and that's due to this event being listened for. And also, if I rearrange in the same list, it updates when I release, and that's also because the dropped event is both for dropping into a new list and for rearranging within the same list. And then there's also a disabled flag on most of these directives, so if I disable the drop list group, now I can't drag anything, they just become essentially regular elements. So that's the easiest way to do drop lists. There's more advanced things that you can do with them that I'll show later. But another handy thing that the library gives you is the ability to use classes that it automatically applies. So the CDK directives automatically add these classes to the elements depending on their state. So in this case, each of the CDK drag elements has the corresponding class assigned to it just automatically, and I can write CSS using that selector to style them. And so if I start dragging one, then it will apply new classes to these elements. So I actually get, this is the one that's under the cursor is the preview element. The placeholder is where it's coming from, or if you hover over a new list, that's where it's going to be. It's basically showing where the element's going to be if you release the mouse button. And then there's CSS classes for lists that you can drag to, so that would be the green ones. And then the light blue for the list where the placeholder is currently. There's also these selectors that you can use for animating. So as I mentioned earlier, you can animate the reordering. So here it's smoothly moving the items rather than abruptly changing where they are. And then also you can animate the item moving into the list like that. And so in this case, I have a CSS selector using this, and then I have a CSS transition to do that animation. Another thing they added in the full version of the drag drop library is predicate functions. So I can pass to a CDK drop list a function to run on each item that's going to be dropped in the list to see whether it can be dropped. So you can have conditions on whether an item can be moved into a list. So if I move several items out, into the other list. I cannot move these other elements. I can only move the to element, and that's based on this predicate function looking for the to string. And so this makes it a lot more convenient to have custom behaviors for your lists. So if you wanted to have a list that could only have one item at a time, for example, that'd be much easier to do with a predicate function than to actually update a whole bunch of, basically update an array in all of the other lists for which lists they can point to. Because that was previously the only way that you could change behaviors like this, was to update the pointers between the lists. So then the rest of the API for the drop lists is what I'm showing here. So the pointer thing that I was talking about is this CDK drop list connected to, and you can pass that an array of string IDs. So you can give each drop list an ID string. You can also give it an array of pointers, not pointers, but an array of references to other CDK drop lists. So if you use view child or view children, which is part of Angular, to get references to DOM elements, you can do that to like manually connect your lists. You don't generally have to do this as much now that they've added those new features, but it's still part of the API. We've already seen the data property. There's also a disabled property on the drop list. So if I turn this on, now I can't drag any of the items that are in that list, but I can if it's off. I also have these events. So when one of them fires, they show up as green for a moment. So if I reorder or sort them, the sorting event happens. And these are normal like events in the template that you'd use like any other event in Angular. And so I don't show them in this list of events here, but it would be, you'd use it basically the same as the dropped event. So it'll give you an event object, which has a whole bunch of properties about the sorting event, and you can use that to do some custom behavior if you need it. I'm logging that to the console so we can see what that looks like. So it gives you an object. You can get the current index of the items. That's where you released the mouse button. You can get the previous index where it used to be. You can get a reference to the container and the item itself as well. And then you can also change the orientation. So if I change this to horizontal, now I can have a horizontal list. The CDK drag drop library doesn't change the CSS to make it horizontal. You're basically telling it that I have set my CSS container for the draggable elements to be like display flex with the main axis horizontal, and then you're telling it that that's what you're doing so that when you're dragging items they work properly. So you have to do both of those things. And then, so now I can just drag. I can't drag over to their list yet because these aren't connected. So I don't have a drop list group. So these aren't connected until I actually pass them into the connected to property. And so now I can drag into list B because I've told it that it's connected to that list. I can't move it back until I actually connected that as well. And so now I can move between the two. And of course I get my other events, so whenever I exit this list, I get an exited event and an entered event in the other one. And if I let go, I get the dropped event. And so that's really the full API for the drop lists. There's also an API that's basically as long, they have even more events for the CDK drag elements. And go into that in detail, but the docs describe it really well. In general, this is what the docs look like on the Angular Material website. So it shows you how to bring in the module at the top, and then you get a list of all the different services and directives, things like that. Let's see here. CDK drag, yeah. So we have a few different inputs. We've seen a few of them already. Then they have a whole lot of outputs. So dropped, ended, entered, exited, moved. So if you needed to do pretty much, I think you could do pretty much anything that you need to imperatively if you had to, like if it didn't come in the box. Then I made an example application with Clarity just to show that you can use this with different CSS libraries. So Clarity is VMware's component library for building web applications. They have like a section of their docs that are like explaining how to use it with Angular specifically, but my understanding is that it's like a general CSS library. So in this case, it's a simple calendar application. If I click, I can enter an item. I can drag this around. I'm using some of the CSS classes that it adds to change some styles. So I've set an opacity for the item that's under the cursor while I'm dragging. I think that's the preview item. And then the placeholder, I've offset it a little bit so you can see it moves to the left when it actually settles into the day. And then I'm using like some features of Clarity, like their drop-down menu to set the color, so I can do that. If I click it, I can change it. So this just, again, showing that you can use the drag and drop feature with other component libraries. I have this on GitHub, so the built application you can take a look at. And I have the source code on GitHub as well. This is actually linked to from the Playground app, so if you wanted to, you could just write down the Playground app's URL. And then I wanted to show one more example. So let's see here. This is kind of showing how you can use the drag drop feature to do some more complicated things. So the calendar app was I was using the container to connect all the lists. In this case, I have different lists. So each one of these is a list. And I have these draggable items. And I'm actually updating the connected to property to define the behavior. So if I move an item into this list, it moves it, but once one item is in the list, then I can't move additional items into the list, and that's using the connected to property. And so it's another example of something that you can use drag and drop for. And this is showing the sort of resulting mapping. This is kind of like an example of a mapping interface. So it's a little less intuitive of what you'd use this for than a calendar app. But this is just to show that you can do more advanced things than just making general lists that you can drag things between. You can look at the code for the calendar application. In this application, this is an Angular CLI app. So Angular has its own CLI that lets you build applications and develop them, and also build. So I have a root level app component, which is the default when you have a CLI application. I put one Angular element in it, the calendar component. And so this is a component for the whole calendar. In this case, I'm using tables. I wouldn't generally use tables for layout, but I wanted the styling from the Clarity library, so I'm just using a table for that. This is for Clarity, so I had to put some CSS to make that work. I've applied the Droplist group directive to make the whole body of the table, all of the lists within it connected to each other, so that allows me to drag between the days. And then I have an array for each array that contains an element for each week. So this is each row of the calendar, and I'm iterating over that with ng4. This lets you do iterations in the template with Angular. And then for each day within a week, I have another loop over each day. And each one of those is, I'm using the CDK drop list to make it a drop list. I'm passing in the data for that day. So what I actually did here was I have a 3-dimensional array for the data for each day, and the first 2 dimensions are the week and the day. The last dimension is for each item in that day. And then each one of those items is a form group. So in Angular, when you build forms, you can use form groups to group together controls. So I'm storing the data for the day as 2 different controls, one for the text that actually shows up in the item, so that would be like fly or haircuts, and then the other control is holding the name of the CSS class for the color, so in this case blue, in this case red. And then I have a click event, so that's for when I click into a day, I need to make a new item in that array. I'm also listening for the dropped event, so that way I can update the array when I move the item around. And then for each individual entry within a day, so that would be this one and this one, I can have additional items. These are each items inside of this array. Now I have another Angular component for each one of those entries, and each one of those is draggable by applying the CDK drag directive. I'm applying the CDK drag handle here because that's how it used to work in the experimental version. Now if you don't have a drag handle, the whole thing becomes draggable, so you don't need that. I'm iterating over each form group in the entry state array. So I'm getting a new app entry component for each item, and I'm passing in the form group to that component as an input. So this is a custom input on my app entry component. And then my component also has an output event called delete me, and that's for if I edit this to not have any text. If I hit enter, then it deletes the item, and that's happening because of this delete me event. And then I'm listening to the click here, so that if I actually click into one of these items, I don't want to propagate that click event up to this click event. And so that ends up making my whole calendar. I don't have to say in my template or my TypeScript which lists are connected to each other, because again I'm using this Dropbox group. Then the two things to point out in the TypeScript are these two functions that the CDK gives you for updating the arrays. So there's a move item in array that you can call when you reorder items within a list. So I'm detecting that using the drop event to see if the previous container and the current container are the same. That means that I should reorder the items within the array. The other helper function is transfer array items. So that's if I drag it to a new list. You could just as easily do this by hand, with regular JavaScript or with like Lodash or something, but they give you these helper functions, which are coming from the drag drop library. And so this is my method that I call in the drop event handler. And then I have a bunch of other stuff just for the data, the backend data structures. So this is that three-dimensional array of form groups. You don't have to, there's probably plenty of ways to implement this, but this is just how I chose to do it. And one thing to point out about forms, there's a nice form builder service that you can use in Angular. So if you want to create a form group, you can do that by calling the group method on the service. And each key value pair represents a control, a form control. So in this case, I have a text form control and a color form control, and I'm initializing them to empty strings. And this method is what gets called when I click inside of a day to make a new item. Okay. So that is all the content I have for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it's useful for you.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
With mobile, when you don't have, how the mobile deals with the drag and drop, or do you have like a workaround because you cannot
Yeah.
you cannot the release.
Yeah, I think it has full drag. I think it has full mobile support. So I think if you pull it up, you can just drag it with your finger, like you would with a mouse. I think it just does the right thing, so you don't have to do anything special. Yeah. So this is my GitHub if you're interested in looking at those examples or anything. Yeah, I'll be around for questions if you have any.